Hitler's failed prophecies about world war. He stood before roaring crowds and whispered generals alike, speaking not as a man, but as a self-proclaimed instrument of destiny. Adolf Hitler promised victory with absolute certainty. He predicted the collapse of his enemies, the loyalty of fate itself, and the birth of a 1,000-year empire forged through war. Yet history would transform his prophecies into one of the greatest catalogs of misjudgment the modern world has ever witnessed. World War II did not merely defeat Hitler militarily, it exposed the fatal consequences of believing one's own lies. In the early years of his rise to power, Hitler cultivated an image of near supernatural foresight. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and crushed by economic despair, was desperate for certainty. Hitler offered it in abundance. He predicted that Britain and France would never fight to defend Eastern Europe. He claimed that Germany's enemies were weak, decadent, and divided. These beliefs were not mere rhetoric. They became the foundation of his decisions, shaping a war that would eventually consume the entire world. In 1936, when German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, Hitler privately admitted that if France intervened, Germany would be forced to retreat. Yet no one did. This success confirmed his growing belief that his intuition was infallible. Each gamble that paid off reinforced his conviction that history itself bent to his will. Austria fell without resistance. Czechoslovakia was dismantled through intimidation and diplomacy. Hitler concluded that courage and audacity mattered more than preparation or caution. From this dangerous lesson, his first great prophecy was born, that the Western powers would always back down. By 1939, this illusion hardened into certainty. Hitler declared that Britain and France would never go to war over Poland. He dismissed their guarantees as empty threats, predicting another bloodless victory. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Hitler expected outrage, protests, and ultimately silence. Instead, Britain and France declared war. Though Germany achieved rapid military success in Poland, Hitler had fundamentally misjudged the political reality of Europe. World War II had begun not as he envisioned, a short controlled campaign, but as a global siege conflict that Germany was not prepared to sustain. Still, early victories seemed to vindicate him. The fall of France in 1940 shocked the world and confirmed Hitler's belief that destiny favored him. He predicted that Britain, isolated and humiliated, would soon seek peace. He underestimated British resolve, misjudged Winston Churchill's leadership, and misunderstood the psychological power of resistance. Hitler believed air power alone could break Britain's will. The failed Battle of Britain proved otherwise. For the first time, a major German campaign collapsed not because of military weakness, but because of strategic arrogance. Hitler's most catastrophic prophecy emerged from this pattern of self-deception, his belief that the Soviet Union would collapse within months. In 1941, he predicted that invading Russia would be easier than defeating France. He saw the Soviet state as a fragile structure held together by fear, racial inferiority, and incompetence. He believed that one decisive blow would cause it to disintegrate. Operation Barbarossa was launched not as a cautious campaign, but as a crusade driven by ideology and contempt. The consequences were immediate and devastating. German forces advanced rapidly at first, reinforcing Hitler's belief that he was right. But he had ignored Russia's vast geography, brutal winters, industrial capacity, and the resilience of its people. He dismissed warnings from generals, rejected strategic withdrawals, and insisted that his will alone could overcome reality. As winter closed in and supply lines collapsed, Hitler's prophecies hattered. The war in the East became a grinding struggle of attrition. One Germany could never win. Nowhere was Hitler's failed foresight more tragic than at Stalingrad. He predicted that the city would fall quickly and that its capture would break Soviet morale. Instead, it became a symbol of German destruction. Surrounded, starving and freezing, the Sixth Army waited for relief that never came. Hitler forbade retreat, insisting that surrender was impossible because his destiny did not allow defeat. Over 300,000 German soldiers were lost. It was not merely a military disaster. It was the psychological turning point of the war. As the conflict dragged on, Hitler's prophecies grew darker and more detached from reality. He predicted miracle weapons that would reverse Germany's fortunes. He believed that the Allied coalition would fracture under pressure. He insisted that betrayal, not his decisions, explained every setback. His leadership style became increasingly paranoid and isolated. He replaced strategy with faith, logic with obsession, and accountability with blame. The consequences were catastrophic beyond measure. Entire cities were reduced to ash. Millions of civilians were murdered, starved, or displaced. The Holocaust, driven by ideological certainty and racial prophecy, revealed the ultimate danger of believing history has chosen one man as its judge. Germany itself was destroyed, physically, morally, and spiritually. The nation that had entrusted its future to prophetic certainty was left divided, occupied, and traumatized. In the final months of the war, Hitler retreated into fantasy. He predicted last-minute victories that never came. He imagined armies that no longer existed, and salvation that reality could not provide. Even as Berlin collapsed, he clung to the belief that history would vindicate him. Instead, history delivered its final verdict in silence and ruin. Hitler's failed prophecies remind us that absolute certainty is often the enemy of true. When power silences doubt, when ideology replaces evidence, and when leaders mistake belief for reality, destruction follows. World War II stands as a warning written in blood that no individual, no matter how persuasive or confident, can bend history without consequence. The danger is not prophecy itself, but the human willingness to believe it without question. From the moment Adolf Hitler tasted his first political victories, he began to believe that his intuition was not merely sharp, but prophetic. What initially appeared as bold political instinct slowly transformed into a dangerous conviction that he possessed an almost mystical ability to foresee events. This belief did not emerge overnight. It was forged through a series of early successes that seemed to defy logic, expert advocacy, and established political norms. Each triumph reinforced the idea that Hitler's personal judgment outweighed the collective wisdom of generals, diplomats, and economists. Over time, this illusion of infallibility became the central engine driving his most reckless decisions and, ultimately, Germany's destruction. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation desperate for certainty. Economic collapse, political chaos, and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles had shattered public confidence. Hitler entered this environment presenting himself as a man of unwavering certainty. When he became chancellor in 1933, many conservative elites believed they could control him. Hitler, however, believed the opposite. He interpreted his rise not as political luck or compromise, but as proof that F8 favored him. The speed with which he dismantled democratic institutions and consolidated power confirmed this belief. Opposition crumbled faster than expected, reinforcing his sense that instinct, not caution, was the key to success. This psychological transformation accelerated with foreign policy gambles. In 1936, Hitler ordered German troops into the Rhineland, directly violating internationally agreements. Militarily, Germany was weak. The army had strict orders to retreat if France responded. Hitler later admitted that these were the most nerve-wracking days of his life. When France did nothing, Hitler drew a catastrophic lesson. He concluded that his enemies lacked the will to act and that boldness itself was a weapon. The victory was not merely strategic, it was psychological. From that point forward, restraint appeared unnecessary, even foolish. The Anschluss with Austria in 1938 deepened this illusion. Hitler expected resistance, possibly even civil war. Instead, German troops were welcomed by cheering crowds. Once again, reality seemed to align perfectly with his expectations. He interpreted this not as a unique cultural and political situation, but as universal confirmation that his instincts were flawless. Dissenting voices within the military and government were increasingly ignored. Hitler began to equate caution with weakness and skepticism with disloyalty. The Munich Agreement later that year sealed this belief system. By threatening war over Czechoslovakia, Hitler forced Britain and France into appeasement. The Sudetenland was handed over without a sin. Shot being fired. Hitler did not see this as a diplomatic compromise born of fear and miscalculation by Western leaders. He saw it as proof that his will could bend international order itself. From his perspective, history was no longer something to be studied, it was something to be commanded. This growing faith in intuition profoundly altered Hitler's decision-making process. He increasingly dismissed expert analysis, especially when it conflicted with his own beliefs. Economic warnings about resource shortages were brushed aside. Military assessments highlighting logistical weaknesses were ignored. Hitler trusted his inner voice above all else. This mindset created an echo chamber in which success validated belief, and belief justified risk. The invasion of Poland in 1939 revealed how dangerous this transformation had become. Hitler predicted with certainty that Britain and France would not intervene. He believed their leaders were too divided, too traumatized by World War I, to fight again. Even when they issued formal guarantees to Poland, Hitler dismissed them as empty gestures. When war was declared, it came as a genuine shock. Although Germany achieved rapid military success in Poland, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Hitler had miscalculated, but instead of reflecting, he rationalized. He convinced himself that the declaration of war did not matter because his instincts would still lead Germany to victory. The fall of France in 1940 seemed to prove him right. Against expectations, German forces defeated one of Europe's strongest armies in WWII case. Hitler's confidence now hardened into near religious certainty. He believed he possessed an intuitive genius that professional soldiers lacked. Generals who questioned him were sidelined or humiliated. Decision-making became centralized around Hitler's personal will, reducing the German war machine as ability to adapt. This mindset reached its most destructive form in Hitler's approach to the Soviet Union. He believed that his instincts revealed a fundamental truth, that the Soviet state was weak, artificial, and destined to collapse. This was not a conclusion reached through careful intelligence analysis, but through ideological belief and personal conviction. Hitler trusted his intuition over geography, climate, and history, warnings about Russia's size, industrial capacity, and manpower were dismissed as pessimism. Once the invasion began, early successes once again fed the illusion. Rapid advances confirmed Hitler's belief that he was right. But when reality shifted, when supply lines stretched, resistance hardened, and winter approached, Hitler could not adjust. To admit error would mean questioning the very foundation of his authority. Instead, he doubled down. Retreat back. On me unthinkable. Adaptation was replaced by stubborn insistence that willpower alone could overcome material reality. As the war progressed, Hitler's reliance on intuition turned increasingly irrational. He believed that his enemies would collapse from internal tension, that new weapons would magically reverse defeats, and that loyalty could be commanded through fear alone. Each failed prediction narrowed his worldview further. Rather than learning from mistakes, he blamed betrayal, cowardice, or conspiracy. His circle shrank, his decisions grew more erratic, and Germany's situation worsened. The human cost of this psychological flaw was staggering. Millions of soldiers were sent into unwinnable battles. Civilians endured bombing, starvation, and displacement. Entire cities were sacrificed to Hitler's refusal to accept reality. What began as confidence became delusion, and what began as bold leadership became catastrophic stubbornness. In the end, Hitler's belief in his own infallible intuition did not collapse dramatically. It eroded slowly, buried beneath ruins and corpses. Even as Berlin fell, he clung to the idea that history had misunderstood him. This final refusal to confer reality stands as the ultimate lesson of his life. Early success can be the most dangerous teacher of all. When intuition goes unchallenged, when power eliminates doubt, and when belief replaces evidence, even the most confident leader can lead a nation into irreversible disaster. From the earliest stages of World War II, Adolf Hitler's strategic vision was poisoned by a fatal habit. He consistently underestimated his enemies. This was not a single miscalculation, but a recurring pattern rooted in ideology, arrogance, and selective perception. Hitler did not merely misjudge the military strength of Britain, the Soviet Union, and later the United States. He misunderstood their psychology, resilience, and capacity to adapt. These errors were not accidents of war. They were the predictable consequences of a worldview that confused contempt with insight and belief with reality. Hitler's underestimation of his enemies began long before the first shots were fired. His worldview divided nations into categories of strength and weakness based on racial ideology, political structure, and his personal interpretation of history. Liberal democracies, in his eyes, were decadent and fragile. He believed that Britain and France were exhausted by World War I, paralyzed by internal divisions, and unwilling to make sacrifices for distant causes. This belief shaped his confidence that the Western powers would not seriously resist German expansion in Europe. Initially, events appeared to confirm his assumptions. The weak international response to Germany's rearmament and territorial velocity convinced Hitler that Britain and France lacked the courage to act. When he absorbed Austria and dismantled Czechoslovakia without triggering war, his contempt deepened. He did not interpret these events as diplomatic failures by his opponents, but as evidence of their inherent weakness. In Hitler's mind, nations that debated, negotiated, and hesitated were already defeated. This mindset had a critical point in 1939. Hitler believed that Britain and France would never fight over Poland. He viewed their guarantees as symbolic gestures intended to save face, not binding commitments. He underestimated the political pressure on democratic leaders, particularly the fear of losing credibility altogether. When Britain and France declared war, Hitler was stunned, not strategically unprepared, but psychologically shocked. Yet even then, he refused to reassess his assumptions. Instead, he minimized the threat, believing that Britain would soon collapse under pressure. The defeat of France in 1940 reinforced Hitler's misjudgments rather than correcting them. France's rapid collapse convinced him that democratic states were structurally incapable of sustained resistance. He assumed Britain would logically seek peace, calculating that no nation could continue the war alone. What he failed to understand was that Britain's strength was not rooted solely in military capacity, but in national identity, political leadership, and the psychological refusal to surrender. Hitler profoundly underestimated Winston Churchill. He saw him as an outdated imperial figure clinging to a dying empire. He failed to grasp how Churchill's rhetoric could mobilize public resolve, or how Britain's island geography and naval power provided strategic depth. Hitler believed air power alone could break British morale. The failure of the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain exposed this miscalculation. British society did not fracture under bombing, it hardened. Hitler had mistaken fear for weakness. His contempt for Britain also extended to its empire and allies. He underestimated Britain's ability to draw on global resources and maintain long-term resistance. More critically, he failed to understand that Britain's survival would serve as a bridge for American involvement. Hitler viewed the United States as politically divided, racially mixed, and militarily inexperienced. He did not take American industrial potential seriously until it was too late. By the time Germany declared war on the United States in 1941, Hitler had expanded the conflict beyond any realistic chance of victory. Yet Hitler's greatest and most catastrophic underestimation was reserved for the Soviet Union. His perception of the USSR was shaped almost entirely by ideology. He believed the Soviet state was a fragile construction held together by terror, led by incompetent leaders, and populated by people he considered racially inferior. He interpreted Stalin's purges of the Red Army as proof that the Soviet military was incapable of effective resistance. Hitler believed that once attacked, the Soviet system would collapse like a rotten structure struck by a single blow. This belief ignored fundamental realities. The Soviet Union possessed immense geographical depth, enormous manpower reserves, and a capacity for industrial relocation unmatched by any other nation. Hitler underestimated the resilience of Soviet society and the brutal effectiveness of a regime fighting for survival. He also ignored the emotional power of defending one's homeland. What he expected to be a short campaign became a WWII of annihilation. In the early months of the invasion, German advances seemed to validate Hitler's assumptions. Soviet forces retreated, millions were captured, and entire regions fell rapidly. But Hitler misinterpreted retreat as collapse. He failed to understand Soviet strategic patience and capacity for regeneration. As German forces pushed deeper, supply lines stretched, equipment wore down, and resistance intensified. The Soviet Union did not break, it adapted. Winter exposed the depth of Hitler's miscalculation. German troops were unprepared, both materially and psychologically, for prolonged warfare in extreme conditions. Hitler had dismissed such concerns as defeatist thinking. When his generals urged flexibility, he saw it as weakness. The Soviet counter-offensive near Moscow shattered the illusion of inevitability. Yet even then, Hitler clung to the belief that sheer will could overcome reality. This pattern continued throughout the war. Hitler underestimated Soviet industrial recovery, ignoring intelligence about factories relocated east of the Ural Mountains. He dismissed reports of growing Red Army effectiveness as exaggerations. At Stalingrad, he underestimated Soviet strategic planning and resolve, believing the city's fall was inevitable. Instead, German forces were encircled and destroyed. It was the clearest proof that Hitler's assumptions about his enemy were fundamentally wrong. The human cost of these misjudgments was immense. Millions of soldiers died because their enemy was underestimated and their own limitations ignored. Civilians across Europe suffered under occupation, bombardment, and starvation as the war dragged on far beyond Hitler's expectations. Entire nations were consumed by a conflict fueled not only by ambition but by contempt. In the final years of the war, Hitler's underestimation became delusion. He believed his enemies were on the verge of collapse, even as Allied forces closed in from all sides. He misread determination as desperation and coordination as coincidence. Reality no longer mattered. Belief replaced evidence. Hitler's downfall demonstrates a universal truth of history. The greatest danger in conflict is not an enemy's strength, but the refusal to recognize it. By underestimating his opponents, Hitler transformed manageable risks into irreversible disasters. His enemies survived because they adapted, endured, and believed in something beyond prophecy. He failed because he never truly understood the people he sought to destroy. Adolf Hitler's most destructive decisions during World War II emerged from a single, fatal substitution. Ideology replaced strategic realism. Nowhere was this more evident or more catastrophic than in his decision to invade the Soviet Union. What should have been a cold calculation of geography, logistics, manpower, and time instead became an ideological crusade driven by racial fantasy, historical myth, and personal obsession. Strategy, which demands flexibility and respect for reality, was suffocated by belief. The result was a war not merely against an enemy state, but against facts themselves. From the beginning, Hitler did not view the Soviet Union as a conventional military opponent. He saw it as an ideological abomination, a Judeo-Bolshevik construct that, in his mind, violated the natural order of history. This belief shaped every aspect of his thinking. The Soviet state was not something to be assessed, it was something to be destroyed. In Hitler's worldview, Marxism was incompatible with strength. Slavic peoples were incapable of sustained resistance, and the Soviet system was already rotting from within. These assumptions were not conclusions drawn from intelligence reports or military analysis. They were articles of faith. This ideological certainty created a dangerous illusion of simplicity. Hitler believed that defeating the Soviet Union would be easier than defeating France. He predicted that a single, rapid campaign would shatter the Red Army and cause the Soviet state to collapse under its own contradictions. He dismissed the need for long-term planning, winter preparation, or economic sustainability. War, in his mind, was not a complex system of interlocking variables. It was a test of will and racial destiny. Professional military planners understood the risks. Germany lacked sufficient oil, faced immense logistical challenges, and would be forced to fight across vast distances with limited infrastructure. Many warned that invading the Soviet Union while Britain remained unconquered would expose Germany to a prolonged multi-front war. Hitler rejected these concerns. To him, they represented a failure of belief. Strategy that contradicted ideology was not merely wrong, it was disloyal. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was therefore conceived not as a flexible campaign, but as an ideological assault. Its objectives were vast, vague, and unrealistic. The plan assumed that the Soviet Union would collapse before Germany's weaknesses became relevant. Cities were to fall quickly, resources would be seized effortlessly, and resistance would evaporate. This was not strategy grounded in evidence, it was prophecy disguised as planning. Early successes reinforced Hitler's ideological confidence. German forces advanced rapidly, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and vast territories. Hitler interpreted these developments as confirmation of his beliefs. He did not see them as temporary advantages in a long war, but as proof that the enemy was fundamentally inferior. Each victory deepened his contempt for strategic caution. Instead of preparing for resistance, he accelerated demands. Instead of consolidating gains, he expanded objectives. Ideology also dictated brutality. The invasion was framed not merely as a military operation, but as a racial war of annihilation. Civilians were targeted, entire populations starved, and prisoners of war treated as expendable. This was not only a moral catastrophe, it was a strategic one. The extreme violence ensured that Soviet civilians and soldiers alike fought not for ideology, but for survival. Hitler's belief that terror would break resistance revealed his misunderstanding of human psychology. Fear did not destroy Soviet resolve, it hardened it. As the campaign progressed, cracks appeared in the ideological vision. Supply lines stretched beyond capacity. Equipment broke down. Casualties mounted. Soviet forces regrouped, adapted, and counterattacked. None of this fit Hitler's expectations. Rather than revising his assumptions, he blamed individuals. Generals were accused of cowardice. Intelligence officers were accused of deception. Reality itself became the enemy. The onset of winter exposed the hollowness of ideological planning. German troops lacked winter clothing, adequate fuel, and proper shelter. Hitler had dismissed preparations for cold weather as defeatist thinking. He believed the war would be over before winter mattered. When temperatures dropped and mobility collapsed, ideology offered no solutions. Faith could not warm frozen engines or feed starving soldiers. At this critical moment, strategic realism demanded flexibility. Tactical withdrawals, consolidation, and prioritization could have preserved German forces. Hitler forbade it all. Retreat contradicted ideology. To step back would mean admitting that belief had limits. Instead, he issued rigid orders to hold ground at all costs. Entire units were sacrificed to preserve the illusion of control. This pattern repeated itself again and again. At Stalingrad, ideology once more replaced strategy. The city's symbolic value outweighed its military importance. Hitler demanded its capture not because it was strategically decisive, but because its name carried ideological meaning. When Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army, retreat was still possible. Hitler refused. Surrender was incompatible with destiny. Over 300,000 soldiers were lost to starvation, cold, and death. Ideology had claimed its price. Even after Stalingrad, Hitler failed to learn. He continued to underestimate Soviet industrial recovery, dismissing reports of factories relocated beyond German reach. He ignored evidence of improved Red Army coordination and leadership. He believed that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, even as Soviet forces grew stronger. New reality was forced to conform to belief, rather than reshape it. As the war dragged on, ideology narrowed Hitler's vision further. He became obsessed with miracle weapons and imagined internal collapses among his enemies. He believed that the Soviet Union was sustained only by fear and would eventually disintegrate. He mistook endurance for weakness and adaptation for desperation. Strategy became reactive, rigid, and increasingly detached from the battlefield. The consequences extended far beyond military defeat. Millions of civilians died in territories turned into ideological killing fields. Entire regions were devastated not because it was strategically necessary, but because belief demanded destruction. Germany's own population suffered as resources were drained into an unwinner. WWII war driven by fantasy rather than reason. In the final phase of the conflict, ideology offered Hitler one last refuge: denial. As Soviet armies advanced toward Berlin, he continued to issue orders to non-existent divisions. He imagined reversals that reality no longer allowed. Strategy had completely vanished, replaced by a closed system of belief that could not be corrected, because it could not be questioned. The invasion of the Soviet Union stands as the clearest demonstration of how ideology can corrupt decision-making at the highest level. Hitler did not lose because he lacked intelligence, resources, or opportunity. He lost because he rejected reality whenever it conflicted with belief. Strategy requires humility, the willingness to adjust, to listen, and to accept limits. Ideology demands certainty and punishes doubt. History's warning is unmistakable. When leaders allow belief to override evidence, when ideology silences strategy, and when power removes accountability, failure becomes inevitable. Hitler's war in the East was not doomed by fate alone. It was doomed the moment ideology replaced realism, turning conquest into catastrophe and belief into ruin. One of Adolf Hitler's most destructive traits during World War II was his absolute refusal to accept failure. What began as stubborn confidence gradually hardened into rigid denial, and this denial transformed military setbacks into irreversible catastrophes. For Hitler, admitting error was not merely a strategic concern, it was a psychological impossibility. His authority, identity, and belief in destiny were built on the illusio of infallibility. To acknowledge failure would mean shattering the myth that sustained his power. As a result, Germany did not simply lose battles, it bled itself dry in disasters that could have been mitigated or avoided altogether. In the early years of the war, Hitler's unwillingness to accept failure appeared almost harmless. Early victories allowed him to override military caution without immediate consequences. When generals expressed doubts, Hitler interpreted them as a lack of faith rather than professional judgment. Success validated his belief that hesitation was weakness, and that boldness alone shaped history. This mindset became deeply entrenched as the war expanded. Every warning ignored without consequence made the next warning easier to dismiss. As Germany moved deeper into prolonged conflict, the cost of this attitude grew exponentially. War is inherently unpredictable, demanding flexibility and constant reassessment. Hitler rejected this reality. He believed that willpower could substitute for logistics, that loyalty could replace planning, and that obedience could overcome material shortages. When setbacks occurred, he did not ask why his plans had failed. Instead, he searched for scapegoats. Generals were accused of incompetence. Soldiers were blamed for lacking courage. Failure, in Hitler's mind, was always external. This mindset became deadly on the Eastern Front. When the invasion of the Soviet Union failed to achieve a decisive victory in 1941, the strategic situation demanded adjustment. German forces were exhausted, overstretched, and vulnerable. Experienced commanders urged limited withdrawals to shorten lines and preserve strength. Hitler categorically refused. Retreat to him was synonymous with defeat, and defeat was incompatible with destiny. He issued strict stand-fast orders, forcing troops to hold exposed positions regardless of cost. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed because they were forbidden to move. Soldiers froze, starved, and died, defending ground that held no strategic value. These losses were not the result of enemy brilliance alone, but of leadership paralysis at the highest level. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge failure turned tactical setbacks into annihilation. This pattern repeated itself with increasing severity, culminating in the disaster at Stalingrad. From the outset, Hitler's fixation on the city was emotional and symbolic rather than strategic. Its name, associated with Stalin, transformed it into a psychological obsession. When the battle became bogged down in brutal urban warfare, commanders warned that the situation was deteriorating. Supply lines were fragile, flanks were weak, and Soviet forces were regrouping. Hitler dismissed these concerns. He believed that surrender or withdrawal would send a message of weakness, undermining his authority and the morale of the German people. When Soviet forces launched their counteroffensive and encircled the German Sixth Army, the situation was still salvageable. A breakout was possible. Generals pleaded for permission to retreat while the army still had strength. Hitler refused. He insisted that the army would be supplied by air and ordered it to hold its position at all costs. This decision was not based on logistical reality. The Luftwaffe lacked the capacity to supply such a force, but on Hitler's need to deny failure. As weeks passed, the reality inside the encirclement became unbearable. Soldiers lacked food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Wounded men froze to death. In ruins, disease spread, hope evaporated. Yet Hitler continued to issue commands as if will alone could reverse the situation. He promoted the commander of the trapped army to field marshal, subtly signaling that suicide was preferable to surrender. This gesture revealed the moral bankruptcy of his leadership. Preservation of his myth mattered more than the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. When Stalingrad finally fell, it marked a turning point not only militarily, but psychologically. Germany had suffered a defeat of unprecedented scale, yet Hitler did not learn. He did not accept responsibility or revise his approach. Instead, he hardened his stance. The disaster convinced him that even stricter control was necessary. He centralized command further, reducing the autonomy of experienced officers. Decision-making slowed, adaptability vanished, and fear replaced initiative throughout the military hierarchy. As the war continued, Hitler's refusal to accept failure infected every level of strategy. Defensive lines were ordered to hold long after they had lost tactical value. Cities were declared fortresses and condemned to destruction rather than abandoned to save lives. Soldiers were executed for retreating without permission, even when retreat was the only rational option. The message was clear, reality was irrelevant, and obedience mattered more than survival. This rigidity extended beyond the battlefield. As Allied bombing devastated German cities, Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of destruction. He promised miraculous reversals and secret weapons that would change the course of the war. These promises were not strategic plans. They were psychological defenses against admitting defeat. By clinging to fantasies of salvation, Hitler delayed necessary decisions that could have reduced civilian suffering and preserved what remained of Germany's future. The human cost of this denial was immense. Millions of soldiers died in hopeless situations because retreat was forbidden. Civilians were trapped in besieged cities, starved, bombed, and sacrificed to maintain the illusion of control. Families were destroyed not because defeat was inevitable, but because adaptation was impossible under a leader who could not accept error. In the final phase of the war, Hitler's refusal to accept failure reached its most tragic form. As Allied forces closed in Berlin, he continued to plan counteroffensives with non-existent units. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed, believing that determination alone could reverse collapse. Reality had completely severed its connection to leadership. Germany's destruction was no longer being managed, it was being denied. Hitler's downfall was not caused solely by superior enemy forces. It was accelerated by a leadership style that treated failure as treason and reality as an enemy. History shows that defeat becomes inevitable when leaders cannot admit mistakes. War demands adjustment, humility, and the courage to recognize limits. Hitler possessed none of these qualities. The tragedy of World War II is not only that it was fought, but that it was prolonged and intensified by one man's inability to say, "I was wrong." In refusing to accept failure, Hitler ensured that failure would be absolute. His legacy stands as a warning. When power becomes allergic to truth, catastrophe follows, not suddenly, but relentlessly, until nothing remains to save. At the heart of Adolf Hitler's worldview was an unshakable belief in destiny. He did not see himself merely as a political leader or military commander, but as a chosen instrument of history, guided by forces greater than reason, evidence, or human limitation. This belief shaped every major decision he made during World War II, and ultimately destroyed both him and the nation he ruled. Hitler's faith in destiny was not harmless mysticism. It was a dangerous psychological framework that justified absolute power, silenced doubt, and transformed catastrophic errors into acts of supposed historical necessity. In the end, it was this belief, more than any single military defeat, that annihilated Germany and left behind a timeless warning about unchecked power. From his earliest political speeches, Hitler framed his rise as inevitable. He spoke of providence, fate, and historical mission, presenting himself as the answer to Germany's humiliation. After World War I, for a nation shattered by defeat and economic despair, this message was intoxicating. Destiny offered certainty where democracy offered debate. Hitler's personal survival through political violence, failed coups, and economic collapse reinforced his belief that he was protected by forces beyond ordinary men. Each escape from danger convinced him that history itself was on his side. As his power grew, destiny became the foundation of his authority. Hitler did not rule through persuasion alone, but through absolute certainty. He demanded obedience, not because his arguments were always sound, but because he claimed insight into the future itself. To disagree with him was not simply to question a policy, it was to stand against destiny. This mindset poisoned the decision-making process at every level of the Nazi state. Rational debate gave way to loyalty tests, and expertise was subordinated to belief. During the early successes of German expansion, Hitler interpreted victory as validation of his destiny. When risks paid off, he did not credit circumstance or enemy weakness. He credited fate. Each triumph strengthened the myth that he was infallible. This psychological reinforcement was crucial. Destiny, once proven in the mind of its believer, becomes immune to contradiction. Failures are dismissed as temporary setbacks, while successes are elevated to proof of divine favor. This belief deeply affected Hitler's approach to war. He did not see conflict as a complex interaction of resources, alliances, and human endurance. He saw it as a test of will, where the SID with greater belief deserved to win. This distorted perception allowed him to dismiss logistical realities and material limitations. Destiny, he believed, would compensate for shortages, exhaustion, and strategic mistakes. It was a fatal miscalculation. As the war expanded, destiny became a shield against accountability. When campaigns failed, Hitler did not question his assumptions. Instead, he blamed betrayal, cowardice, or insufficient faith. The more reality contradicted him, the more tightly he clung to belief. This psychological trap narrowed his world. Advisors who challenged him were marginalized or dismissed. Information that conflicted with his expectations was rejected outright. Leadership became isolated, rigid, and increasingly delusional. This dynamic reached its most destructive form in the later years of the war. As Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, Hitler's belief in destiny intensified rather than weakened. He predicted miraculous reversals, secret weapons, and sudden collapses among his enemies. These predictions were not based on intelligence or realistic assessment. They were expressions of faith. Destiny, he believed, could still intervene. Each delay in defeat was interpreted as confirmation that history had not yet abandoned him. The human consequences of this belief were devastating. Millions of soldiers were sacrificed in hopeless situations because retreat would contradict the narrative of destiny. Civilians were left in destroyed cities, promised salvation that never came. Germany's remaining resources were drained in pursuit of imagined turning points. Destiny demanded sacrifice, and Hitler was willing to offer the lives of others to sustain his belief. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, the myth of destiny became a prison. Hitler could no longer adjust strategy without undermining the foundation of his authority. To admit that defeat was inevitable would mean admitting that destiny had never existed. Instead, he retreated into fantasy. He issued orders to non-existent armies, planned counterattacks with imaginary forces, and convinced himself that loyalty and willpower could still reverse collapse. Reality ceased to matter. In the final days, destiny revealed its true nature. It offered no rescue, no vindication, and no mercy. Berlin fell into ruins. Civilians died in the streets. Soldiers fought without hope. The man who claimed to embody history was reduced to hiding underground, surrounded by the wreckage of his beliefs. Destiny, once his greatest source of confidence, became a silent witness to his failure. Hitler's death did not bring closure to the devastation he caused. Germany was left divided, occupied, and morally shattered. Millions were dead. Entire regions lay in ruins. The nation that had entrusted its future to destiny paid the ultimate price for surrendering reason to belief. The idea that one man could embody history had consumed everything in its path. The lesson is not confined to the past. Hitler's story demonstrates how belief in destiny can become a tool of destruction when combined with absolute power. When leaders claim that history has chosen them, accountability disappears. Mistakes become unavoidable sacrifices. Opposition becomes treason. Reality becomes optional. This mindset does not require madness. It requires certainty without humility. History does not need props. It needs restraint, skepticism, and the courage to question authority. Hitler's legacy stands as a universal warning. When power is justified by destiny, human life becomes expendable. When belief replaces evidence, catastrophe follows. And when leaders convince themselves that they cannot be wrong, they ensure that their failure will be total.